And I disagree with you on pretty much everything.
Right. Well, that's nice. I mean,
No,
it's
but
nice
Okay, welcome to everybody. It is 3 o'clock. You should find yourself here in Mackey Auditorium. The title of our session this afternoon is Trump's 100 Days. Are we great yet? Pretty provocative title. I don't make up the titles, but I like that one. This is panel number 3711. My name is Scott Schaefer. I'll be your moderator for this panel. And I'd like you to take just a moment, if you would, and make sure that your phones are on mute so we don't get interrupted and with your wonderful ringtone. We are also going to use, because this is a large venue, we're going to use the CWA app for question submittal. So hopefully by now everybody is familiar with that on your smartphone, the CWA app. You can download that, and we will take questions that way. We will also have a note card system if you do not have a smartphone. So to ask a question, you go to the app, select the session in the app, which again is 3711, and you tap Live Q&A, and then you insert your question. You may also raise your hand at any time to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Where are my producers? There's one over there, Charlie, and you'll see Linda right here. So if you don't have an app or you don't want to use the app, raise your hand, they'll give you a note card. But we are trying to direct questions to the app because it goes a little faster when we get more in. Also, if you do either of those things and you're a student, please let us know that, because students here at the CWA get first priority, and we'd like to make sure we get your questions in. So, with that, I think we're about to get started. I'm going to introduce these folks in a minute, but I was getting ready for the panel, and I was preparing my garden, like lots of us around Boulder right now are preparing our gardens for vegetable planting. And this year I'm doing a special combination of steer manure and sheep peat to fortify the soil. And so I got done. It was quite a bit of work. I got done. I went in and cleaned up and sat down to watch a little news. You can see where I'm going with this. And I'm a channel flipper. I like to watch the left, the right. I can't find middle. And I'm watching all the news, and I said, here's these people on air doing a much better job spreading some of the same organic material on the air as I was in my garden. We are fortunate today, though, to have some non-gardeners, some political analysts and authors that are going to give us their best insight into what's going on in Washington, D.C., and particularly this new administration we have. How this is going to work is I'm going to give a quick introduction. You can look in your conference materials for deeper introductions, and then each of the panelists will give us a 5 to 7 minute opening set of comments or less, and then we will start taking questions from the Q&A app and go from there. So I hope it's going to be interactive. I'm sure in Boulder, I'm sure it'll be interactive, and we'll get started. So immediately to my right is John Nichols. He's a national affairs writer, the national affairs writer of The Nation, co-founder of Free Press, author and co-author of many books, including The Genius of Impeachment, and The Life and Death of American Journalism. I want to talk with you about that a little later. He frequently appears on the BBC, on NPR, on MSNBC, and CNN. He's a special in constitutional issues related to elections and presidential accountability. So that is John. Stephen Moore is next to John. Stephen's a contributor, CNN, and former economic advisor within President Trump's 2016 campaign. He's a writer at the Wall Street Journal, economic and public policy subjects. He's also served on their editorial board. He's the founder and former president of the Club for Growth and a distinguished fellow for the Project for Economic Growth at the Heritage Foundation. You have seen him recently a lot on TV, commenting in his position earlier during the campaign as a senior economic advisor to Donald Trump, with a focus on tax reform, regulatory reform, and energy policy. Next to Stephen is Mark Fallon. Mark is a international security consultant and author. He's got over 30 years in the heart of America's counterintelligence and counterterrorism strategies, tactics, and operations. Some of the operations that Mark was involved in include investigating Sheikh Abdul Rahman, the blind sheikh, the attack on the USS Cole, and the attacks on 9/11. His book also gives us a little insight into his perspective. It's titled Unjustifiable Means, the inside story of how the CIA, Pentagon, and U.S. government conspired to torture. And then last but not least, we have Robert Kaufman. Robert is the Doxson Professor of Public Policy at Pepperdine University, expert speaker in the area of American foreign policy, security, and international relations. I think we can also learn a little bit about his perspective by looking at the title of his September 2016 op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, What is a Reagan Conservative to Do? His most recent book is titled Dangerous Doctrine, How Obama's Grand Strategy Weakened America. So as you can see, we've got a lot of perspectives spread across the table, and I am so excited to listen carefully to all sides. And we will start with some opening comments from you, John.
Well, I see we're going to go from the ridiculous to the sublime. We'll get down to Kaufman, and he'll see us through all this. What a pleasure to be with you, and wow, what a great-looking crowd. Fantastic. This is what we expected from Boulder, and I know we're probably about evenly divided between left and right. So I know it's not what you're supposed to do, but I actually take seriously the titles of the panels. And so I want to talk for a couple minutes about this 100 days. And then I want to take a lot of notes from these guys, because I just got assigned to write the nation's lead editorial on the first 100 days. And I'm going to gather this all in. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the presidential historian Stanley Cutler. He was a great historian of Nixon's presidency, a guy who really unleashed and found a lot of the Nixon tapes, things of that nature. And Stanley, I think, had the only good line ever about the presidency. He said it is the responsibility of each president to make his predecessor look better. And I would say that in his first 100 days, Donald Trump has indeed made Barack Obama look better. Now, Barack Obama, to my mind, and I'll show my politics, looked pretty good on the way out. But what we have seen in the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, or as we get toward that 100 days, is something that I think needs to be put in perspective, and I love that we're going to try and do it today. Franklin Roosevelt wrecked us, okay, with the 100 days thing. Because Roosevelt came in and said, boy, we're going to do all this in 100 days. And he created this sense that a presidency should be defined in its first 100 days. That is pretty much an absurdity, right? Because the 100 days, you can come to the presidency in a time of war, you can come to the presidency in a time of peace, in a time of prosperity or not, and your first 100 days may or may not tell much about your policy or about where you get. But there are a couple things that we ought to look for in the first 100 days of a presidency, and even in the transition that you get to it. To my mind, the first thing is that you want to, and I'm very serious about this, you want to do a little bit to dial down the fears of those who didn't think you should be president of the United States. Now, in America's case, that's 54% of Americans. And so I waited for President Trump's inaugural address with an eye toward some dialing down of those concerns. And I'm afraid that Mr. Miller and Mr. Bannon did not follow through on that very well. His inaugural address was a disaster, to my view. And it was not a disaster, it's not an ideological thing, whether you like Donald Trump or dislike Donald Trump. It was an opportunity to give a 45-minute to an hour speech in which you really give a vision of the country and the place in the world. You lay out agenda, but you also give people a sense that they are all a part of this thing. And if you want to see a good example of it, I recommend go look at Thomas Jefferson's speech. In 1801, after the most contested election, an unimaginably bitter and contested election, Jefferson worked really hard in that speech to kind of bring a unity to the country, even if he didn't fully achieve it. Trump failed, and he failed badly, in my mind, in that regard. And then, right, served, I don't think, particularly well by his staff. They then decided to come off that with an argument about whether he had a bigger crowd than half of humanity, right? And yeah, it was just giant, right? And then you send another staffer on the next day to say, well, we've got our own facts. And so I just think it was the inaugural was not used well. And then you get the Muslim ban, and which is, I think, very useful in that it allowed the resistance to know full well that you couldn't just have a women's march the first weekend. You were going to the next weekend have to muster hundreds of thousands of people to protest as well. And in fact, you had that. And a court smackdown. And then the final thing, right? The one thing that I think could always unite Republicans, getting rid of Obamacare. And so here you have this one kind of touchstone. And you move in, and Donald Trump says to Paul Ryan, hey, Paul, you know your way around Congress. You've been here a quarter century. You take it. You get us something there. And Paul Ryan ineffectively communicated with the Senate to the point where Rand Paul's trying to burst into a room. He ineffectively communicated with the White House, and he essentially created a plan that could not even unite the Republicans. And so what I would suggest to you is the first 100 days of this presidency, and this is not just simple bashing on Trump. This has been a very, very poorly handled 100 days, and it failed in the most fundamental responsibility. Because the most fundamental responsibility is that you communicate to the American people that you and those you have chosen to be around you are capable of doing this job. And I frankly don't think that this president has done so.
Hi, everyone. Actually, I don't disagree with much of what John said. I love Colorado, by the way. I got here this morning, and I was walking through the halls of one of the buildings, and this lovely lady ran up to me, and she threw her arms around me. She was so excited. She said, I know you, don't I? I said, I don't know, ma'am. She said, I'm sure I've seen you on TV. And I just kind of smiled at her, and I said, well, I don't know, ma'am. What do you watch? And it was so wonderful. She said, it was endearing. She was squeezing me, and she said, she was puzzled. She couldn't figure it out. She said, wait a minute, didn't I see you on Wheel of Fortune last week? And I said, yes, ma'am, that was me. But love Colorado. So a couple things. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the topic of first 100 days and talk. And I agree. Look, in my opinion, I mean, John is right. You've got a president right now who has, what, a 40% approval rating. You can't govern the country with a 40% approval rating. Trump has to figure out how to get from 40 to, 50 or 52 or 54, and then he can do big things. It's difficult to govern the country when you have half the country against you. And, I was thinking when you made that comment about Obama and Trump, I remember when I worked for Reagan, we used to always say, sir, you were blessed by the incompetence of your predecessors. We said, who couldn't look good after succeeding Nixon, Ford, and Carter? And there's a lot of truth to that. So let me just give a few thoughts, because we're going to be here for an hour, and I just want to throw out some thoughts about my time with Donald Trump during the campaign, and just some random things. First of all, if I were in this room a little bit over a year ago, maybe let's say February of last year, and I told you that Donald Trump was going to be the next president, you would have kicked me out. Said, I'm already smoking that, Colorado weed. If you go back a year and a half, about a year and 2 months ago, the odds that Donald Trump was going to be president were 1 in 100. 1 in 100. So it's interesting how sometimes the experts are completely wrong. And in this case, they could not have been more wrong. Trump, a couple things about Trump. So I agree with some of what you said, but one of the things that's so interesting to me about Trump, you all may recall about 3 weeks ago, he had this press conference. I'm sure you remember it. And he was saying some crazy things, the way Trump is. And I think at one point he said, I won the biggest landslide election since, Reagan. And one of the reporters said, well, actually, sir, that's not true. There have been 4, bigger landslides than your election. And Trump said, well, somebody told me I won the biggest landslide, as if that was proof. But what's interesting is I was in the CNN green room when he was giving that speech, and everybody was horrified by the speech. Everyone in CNN and all the people in the media was, oh, that was the worst press conference the president ever gave, and so on. And then the next 3 days, I just went out on the road. I went to places like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and people go, I love Donald Trump's press conference, you know. And the reason I say that is one of the things I really discovered on this campaign trail is that there is an incredible disconnect between the way the elites think about things, the people in Washington, D.C., the people in New York and Wall Street, the people in Hollywood, the people in Silicon Valley, and the way the rest of the country sees it. And by the way, I would add universities to that group of people who kind of live in a bubble, in my opinion. But when you went out in real kind of working class America, that's where you saw people in huge numbers rallying around Trump in ways that, and a lot of the people, by the way, who voted for Trump either were people who had never really voted much before, and a lot of them were just the old Reagan Democrats who, and I sort of disagreed with John a little bit. When I would go around to some of these towns like York, Pennsylvania, or Flint, Michigan, or Rockford, Illinois, and I'd say, how do you think the recovery is going? They would look at me and say, what recovery? There's no recovery here. They were angered by that idea. And Trump, whether you love him or hate him, and I'm sure there's attitudes that run the gambit here, a couple of things that I think are really interesting and admirable about Trump. One is that he got something out there that nobody else understood this year. You had 16 Republicans who ran for president this year. You had Jeb Bush, you had Marco Rubio, you had the governor John Kasich, and all of these others, and they didn't understand what was going on. Jeb Bush spent $100 million on his primary campaign. $100 million. Trump, by the way, virtually spent nothing. That was the amazing thing about Trump's victory. He hardly spent, for those of you who think money in politics is everything, Donald Trump didn't spend virtually a penny. Bush spent $100 million. He virtually got no votes. And Trump saw this out there, that there was this unrest, that the middle class in America is financially stressed out. They believe that politicians of both parties aren't listening to them whatsoever. And in some part, I think these voters were not just rebelling against Obama, which they were, but also the Bush years weren't very good. And one statistic that you all should think about is that it is, and I think was the killer statistic for Hillary, is that it's been 15 years now since the average middle-class American has seen a pay raise. 15 years without a pay raise. So that's not prosperity. That's not growth. And Trump recognized that. A second observation about Trump. For those of you who don't like him, I think it's important to understand he has one similarity to Reagan that I think is so interesting. Reagan and Trump were always, and I wonder if you'd agree with this, John, always underestimated by their opponents. And, Reagan, I don't know if how many of you are old enough to remember the Reagan years, but remember when Reagan first ran for president, liberals were falling on their ground in laughter. Ronald Reagan, a grade B actor, is going to be the president of the United States. And, of course, he turned out to be, whether you agree with his politics or not, he was a hell of a politician. Trump has had that attribute, too, that he was always, and to this day, he is still underestimated. Since I'm running out of time, I'll make one observation about the 100 days where I think I disagree with John. You're right about his fumbles, no question about it. He's made a lot of, and I agree with you entirely. I hated his State of the Union. His inaugural. I actually liked his State of the Union. I didn't like his, I think you're exactly right. It only appealed to his base, and it didn't broaden his appeal to the other 60%. But here's the point. What has every poll said for the last 5, 6, 7 years? What is the issue Americans care about? I hate to tell you this, but it ain't climate change. You go down the list, and climate change is about 20 on the list. What Americans care about, you all know this, is jobs in the economy. Jobs in the economy. They keep saying it over and over again. And then, of course, when we have terrorist incidents, that rises to the top. But it's jobs in the economy. And here's why I disagree a little bit with John, and then I'll surrender the microphone. The economy's really picked up. There's no question. I do believe there was an inflection point that happened on November 7, 2016. Just look what happened to the stock market. Look at what's happened to business spending. Look what's happened to investor confidence. We just came out with a report 10 days ago that consumer confidence in this country is higher than it's been any time in 20 years. Now, that isn't always a great indicator, but it is somewhat of an indicator that people are feeling good about the economy. The stock market's up 11%. Most Americans own stocks, so a rising stock market is a good thing. And my point is, if we get more jobs and we get a good economy, all of the rest of this stuff isn't going to matter a lot. And when I'm on, CNN all the time, and I see you on that too, all they talk about is this Russia stuff and, this. But it's like, to most Americans, that's just noise. That's just noise. If Trump delivers on the economy and jobs, he's going to be an effective and successful president. If he doesn't, he'll be out in 4 years. And that's, I think, the key thing to remember as we go forward.
Well, if your app has a game that says which of these panelists is not like the other, pick me. I'm not sure I belong up here with these guys. I came to the Conference of World Affairs last year, was asked to come, and I was asked to speak on a panel, what do we need in a president? And I called and said, I'm not a political guy. I hate these political pundits. I don't watch that stuff. I don't want to do this. And they said, well, we like to challenge you. We really think you should do it. I said, I'm a national security guy. They said, well, just speak a bit about it from a national security perspective. So I played along, and I came, and I did, and I called that one wrong. And I was interviewed by the Daily Camera, the local paper here, and they interviewed me, and they said, national security expert Mark Fallon made it through the interview without mentioning the name, a current candidate's name. When asked about Donald Trump's endorsement of torture, Fallon's response was, I will say this type of rhetoric is highly irresponsible. The rhetoric I'm hearing now from some candidates are unlawful as well as ineffective and immoral. They are either misinformed, uninformed, or well-informed and consciously making a decision to articulate an unlawful position. Any of those things trouble me. On January 20th, Donald Trump assumed the presidency. He put his left hand on a pair of Bibles, he raised his right hand, and he pledged an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. It's the same oath George Washington took on a balcony in New York City at Federal Hall on April 30th, 1789, as has every successive president. It's an oath that I took entering on duty, first with the Marshal Service, then with NCIS, then with Homeland Security. For me, it was a sacred moment, signifying I would place the public service before self. When Washington was sworn in, Senator McClay from Pennsylvania observed, even the great Washington trembled when his oath was administered, as did it when I did mine, and the chills ran down my spine when I administered that oath to other people, because it means something to us in the national security perspective. When Donald Trump offered his vision of America that we spoke about, he talked about American carnage. He played to his base as if he was a descending savior, proclaiming the carnage would stop here and now because of him, knowing more than the generals. Absent from that speech were the words liberty and equality. George Bush reportedly commented, that was some weird shit. I just want to run through a couple of, I went through some of the first not quite 100 days yet, and I see on day one, well, some of the first changes made was the White House webpage removed references to civil rights, climate change, LGBT rights, healthcare, immigration, and education. By day three, lies were being told about crowd sizes, and alternative facts was coined. The next week, Trump denied refugees and immigrants from Muslim-majority countries into the U.S., was overruled by the courts, deemed unconstitutional. On January 25th, an executive order was leaked, raising the prospect of reinstating black sites and CIA torture. After 2 weeks, there were claims about the fictional Bowling Green terrorist and the Bowling Green massacre. By day 31, Trump purported attacks in Sweden. On day 19, for the first time in history, the vice president had cast the breaking vote to confirm Betsy DeVos as education secretary. DeVos's brother, Eric Prince, founded Blackwater. And last week it was disclosed he arranged a back-channel meeting between Trump affiliates and Putin's confidants. On day 26, National Security Advisor Michael Flynn was forced to resign after his close ties to Russia were publicly confirmed, a day after the White House said Flynn had Trump's full confidence. Sebastian Gorka was brought in from Breitbart to serve as the deputy assistant to the president, a known Islamophobic huckster. He can be found on Twitter under the hashtag #FakeTerrorismExpert. Gorka advocates for the term radical Islamic extremism, a term repudiated by experts. General McMaster, who replaced General Flynn on the National Security Council, refuses to use that term. Secretary of Defense Mattis refuses to use that term. By day 42, Attorney General Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, I usually get laughs in this crowd for that. He recused himself from investigations into Russian interference based on his contacts with Russian intelligence officials that he failed to disclose during his confirmation hearings. By day 44, Trump was claiming Obama ordered illegal wiretaps. He later claimed British intelligence had spied on him, rocking the Five Eyes, and the intelligence community. On day 60, before the White House Intelligence Committee, FBI Director Comey testified there was no basis for Trump's claims, and he revealed to the world publicly that the FBI was investigating collusion between the Trump campaign and Moscow's offensive cyber operation to change the outcome of the election in the favor of Donald John Trump. Last week, BuzzFeed reporter Ali Watkins broke a story that Trump's former foreign policy and campaign advisor, Carter Page, was an unwitting asset for Russian intelligence. Yesterday, it was disclosed that a FISA warrant, a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant, had been issued against Carter Page, and we have been collecting on him, requiring a probable cause that it was likely he was working for a foreign power. I haven't even touched on the dossier compiled by former MI6 agent Christopher Steele. We won't even go to what was happening with that. We now have Representative Nunes bumbling around the White House grounds to obtain information that he would later give back to the White House the next day. Last week, Nunes stepped down as his lead role investigating the Russian hackings. He's now under investigation by the House Ethics Committee for the possible unauthorized disclosure of classified information. On day 76, Breitbart executive Steve Bannon, the strategic advisor, was removed from the National Security Council. From a national security perspective, the lens I view the world through, the first 82 days have been a clown act. It's an international embarrassment, and it has undoubtedly denigrated our national security. There's no doubt in my mind. It's been disorganized, ill-informed, and an inexperienced collection of yes men, not you, or women, family members, not you, loyalists, probably you, failing to recognize the most sacred duty is to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. This country will be great again when the other branches of government fulfill their responsibility, place patriotism before partisanship, and once again preserve the democracy. There, I used his name. Thank you.
I never liked these names of panels. It's as if they came up with them at a Grateful Dead reunion concert. So I'm not going to stick with it because it's rigged. So I'm going to rephrase the panel. Are we better off than we were 100 days ago? Let me keep you in mystery and say that I share many of the misgivings about President Trump's rollout. I was a Marco Rubio person. I'm a Reagan internationalist. And much of what Donald Trump said, his use of the term America First, his denigration of key alliances, all disturbed me, and I thought that was a dangerous direction for the Republican Party to be heading. I wrote a piece that apparently went to Trump on what he should say at his inaugural, quoting Thomas Jefferson, Lincoln, Reagan, and he did exactly the opposite. although Steve Moore's right, you should not underestimate Donald Trump, and in that key respect, he's very similar to Ronald Reagan. Many of the differences loom larger than the similarities. Look, you knew what you were getting with Reagan. There was 30 years of a core philosophy, which even if you didn't like it, and I did, and I do, you knew what Ronald Reagan stood for. Donald Trump voted for a Republican candidate for the first time himself in November of 2016. Michael Flynn was inappropriate. There have been all sorts of missteps. Healthcare was a debacle, including not just Trump, but the Republican leadership that spent 7 years complaining without developing a plausible plan. So I stipulate all that. So you all like that so far. You won't like what comes next. For all that, and I say this provisionally with an asterisk because with Donald Trump, it's like spam. It's mystery meat. You don't know what you're eating. I agree with my great friend and colleague, the great military historian, Victor Davis Hanson, that despite all these caveats and qualifications, Donald Trump may be bad, but Hillary Clinton would have been bad. Contrary to what we've heard here, the Obama years were a disaster. Economically, the weakest, it's not refutable. It's the weakest recovery in the history of a recession. It's anemic. We define deviancy down. In terms of national security, President Obama's improvident slashing of the defense budget, confusing friends and foes, engaging adversaries, putting distance between the United States and our traditional democratic friends, lowered the barriers of aggression in every major geopolitical region, East Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Obama's reset, and Hillary Clinton named it, did more to enable Putin's worst instinct than Trump on his worst and most imprudent days. This is why, for all that, we are probably better off than we were 100 days ago. One, Trump is going to rebuild the American military, which is the single most important thing he can do to restore credible American deterrence and resolve. Two, Trump has a pretty good economic plan, which I think is going to yield 3 or 4% growth, even more, if Trump does the following. One, deregulation. Two, there are already trillions of dollars that were sitting offshore for 8 years, returning now that investors know that they can get a reasonable rate of return on their capital. Three, Donald Trump is unleashing the American energy sector that makes the United States a potential energy superpower that makes Saudi Arabia energy impoverished by comparison. Four, the only government program in history that has ever stimulated the economy. The New Deal didn't get us out of the Depression. Franklin Roosevelt's military buildup did. Among the other benefits of the military buildup, this is the only stimulus package that works. If Donald Trump does all of that and achieves tax reform and deregulation at the same time, we're going to have a much more vibrant economy. Besides building up the military, and I'm a Trump skeptic, Donald Trump has shown a learning curve on national security. He has an excellent national security team. I defy anybody to find someone who is more qualified across the board as a defense intellectual and as a warrior, published author, than Secretary of Defense James Mattis. H.R. McMaster, Trump's second and excellent choice for the National Security Council, made his name, and I wrote a column about it, about the imperative of speaking truth to power. Literally a week after McMaster became National Security Advisor, Steve Bannon is out. Trump's recent action in Syria his recent elevation of his superior national security people to prominence, his recent banishment of Bannon, indicates that Donald Trump, despite all the missteps, has a learning curve. And here's one positive about the healthcare debacle that I think people haven't acknowledged for Donald Trump. One of the raps on Trump is that he was disengaged, he would delegate. As it turned out, by every fair account of the healthcare debate and debacle, unlike Obama, who basically farmed out healthcare and didn't read the bill, every indicator suggests that Donald Trump was actively involved in every stage of the endeavor, trying to build a coalition to get that bill passed. So, is Donald Trump my first choice? No. But in terms of the comparison, it may be that Donald Trump is the equivalent of the best looking person in the physics department. But compared to the Obama years, the years of retreat and American stagnation, Donald Trump at least offers the possibility of restoring American power economically and militarily. So I say with an asterisk, with major qualifications, that it appears, and add Justice Gorsuch to the list, that we are indeed, despite all of his flaws that the speakers have rightly pointed out, we are indeed better off now than we were 100 days ago.
All right, now that we're all in unanimous agreement, we promised you a little spicy panel, and that's, I think, where we're headed. Great debate, great discussion. So let's go back to this Make America Great Again. Honestly, I've never really understood that. I mean, in one sense, it makes me feel bad that we weren't great already. Yeah. In another, it sounds aspirational and kind of neat to be great again. And I've had this discussion around Boulder coffee shops quite a bit. What exactly does it mean for America to be great again? How do we measure greatness?
Oh, look, This isn't a new theme. This is Reagan's theme of 1980 after the decline of the 70s, the defeatism of détente, Jimmy Carter's infamous summit in Camp David where he came back and lectured the American people this was the age of limits. Reagan's campaign theme was that if we remembered the things that made us great in the first place, we would restore American military, economic, and political power and bring down the evil empire. So you may not agree with Trump, but in this theme of making America great again, this is a very consistent theme that actually resonates and is a derivative of the Reagan tradition. This isn't new. I think it's legitimate, and I think that the decade of the years of Obama, when the history books are written, will have a much different view than the crowd of Boulder. It was a bleak 8 years for the United States. And I think Trump's theme is appropriate. Whether he can deliver on or not is the question, but I think his theme resonates powerfully and has deep roots in the best elements of the Republican tradition.
Yeah, look, I think
I'm going to grab a pour, and then I'll let you, because you can, that will bounce and it'll all work brilliantly. Well, just to understand that the operative word was not great, it was again. What Donald Trump did with his slogan, and I've written a lot about it, I think it was a very appropriate slogan, was that he said, I can take you back somewhere. I'm a time traveler from outer space, and I can take you someplace that's better than where we are now. It wasn't, forward to the future, let's make the greatest America ever. It was make America great again. Let's go back to something that isn't here. So something's really wrong with now. And I would suggest to you that it was a palette that allowed people to paint what they wanted to paint on it. And people painted a lot of different things. And some of it was unbelievably unsettling and deeply troubling. Because the again they wanted is an America that we struggled and fought for 2 centuries to advance beyond. And there were shameful elements in Donald Trump's campaign, shameful elements, that sought to play on a desire to go backward in ways that we should never go backward. That wasn't all of his backers, though. I would agree with some of my fellow panelists that an awful lot of the people who wanted it to be great again kind of wanted it to be like when they had a job at the factory and the wife is a guy, the wife was still with them, and the kids hadn't gotten into trouble, and a lot of things that don't have much to do with politics were going okay for them. It became this very emotional desire to go back to something, and they thought that an industrial job would get them there. And in this regard, Donald Trump's slogan was the cruelest lie in American political history. Donald Trump, not going for the applause. Donald Trump is not a stupid man. And Donald Trump, I think Donald Trump, unfortunately, knew a lot of what he was doing. And this is a tragedy. This makes him then a guilty man. Because we are 30 years into a globalization revolution that has changed every way in which we relate to the rest of the world, for good and bad. We are 20 years into a digital revolution that has changed everything about how we communicate. We are 10 years into an automation revolution that is going to change everything about our work and is already doing so. And Donald Trump got up there and lied to people and told them we can jump back around that and somehow it's all going to be fine. This was a cruel, brutally cruel way to play the American people, and to suggest now that we are somehow better off than we were 100 days ago is not just silly, it is Sean Spicer absurd.
No, it's not.
One final thing here. I had a lot of disagreements with Barack Obama. I thought he did a lot of things wrong. But Barack Obama was given the responsibility to pick a Secretary of Energy to be concerned about how we deal with things like nuclear waste. And his first pick was a Nobel Prize winner, and his second pick was one of the top top physicists in the world, one of the most respected people in the world in these areas. Donald Trump picked Rick Perry to be his Secretary of Energy, a guy who wanted to get rid of the job and who admitted in his hearing he was fascinated to find out what was involved with it. Donald Trump lied to the American people about what he could do and what he has now done as President of the United States is to make us less safe, less functional, and to fill positions of public trust with people who should not be in them. America is not better off. It is much worse off because a man who lied to us is now sitting in our presidency.
So, I think the liberal narrative that everything was going so well under Barack Obama was just wrong. And I think it was proven wrong by the election. Hillary Clinton said, I'm going to give you 4 more years. And the American people said, hell no, we can't afford 4 more years of this. And to say that the country was on the right track was obviously something that, the vast majority of Americans disagreed with. So if you looked at on the day before the election, just look at the public opinion polling by CNN and USA Today. 2/3 of Americans on Election Day said America is headed in the wrong direction. Now, look, you all live in a community of college town and so on. College towns are doing fine in America, but a lot of Americans outside in the real world, outside of the bubble of college towns in Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley and Hollywood, aren't feeling the love. They're not seeing it. And these statistics are unbelievable. I mean, this is supposed to be the 8th year of an expansion, of a recovery. This has been the worst recovery since the end of World War II. We've had 9 recessions since the end of World War II. This is by far the worst. Here's one statistic that I think really resonated with people. I talk about it all the time. If the economy had grown as fast under Obama as it did under the Reagan expansion, because it's a nice experiment, because Reagan and Obama both came into office with the economy flat on its back. How many of you remember 20% mortgage interest rates and 15% inflation? I mean, the economy was a disaster at the end of the Carter era. And what's so interesting is, what makes this experiment so interesting is Reagan and Obama did exactly the opposite. Right? Reagan came in and said, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to get inflation under control, we're going to cut government spending, and in one kind of sentence, what was Reaganomics about? It was, remember this, government is not the solution, government is the problem. That was Reaganomics. Obama, you know, he came in with exactly sort of the opposite philosophy. Whatever the problem is, there's a government solution. And think about what we've lived through under Obama. I mean, I would say that the catastrophe was the Obama years. I mean, look at what we've done. We had an $800 billion fiscal stimulus bill that did not create a single job because, as Milton Friedman taught us, and this is the most important lesson of economics for the kids in this room, remember what Milton Friedman used to say? There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. If the government spends $1, it has to take $1 from someone else. Then we had 3 minimum wage increases. Then we had the big tax increase on the rich. Then we added $9.5 trillion to the national debt. In 8 years, we doubled the national debt. The kids and your grandkids and your grandkids' kids are going to be paying for that for the next 100 years. I mean, that is what I call fiscal child abuse, what happened in this country. And by the way, I'm not even going to blame, I mean, look, the last 2 or 3 years of Bush were terrible too. Look at the fact that we have 46 million Americans today on food stamps. 46 million Americans are on food stamps. This is supposed to be a recovery, and 1 out of 7 Americans needs the government to put food on their table. I could go on and on. Some of the statistics I know that you've seen on what's happened to the middle class. For the first time last year in like forever, the life expectancy in this country fell. And it's falling in the middle class, where people are feeling more and more hopeless. So I love the theme of Make America Great Again because it gave Americans hope. And they were feeling absent of hope before this happened. Now, you can say about the fact that the first 100 days have been rotten and so on, but I would point to, again, look at how well the economy has picked up. You see it all along. And this idea, one last thing, and I'll stop. I disagree with John on this idea that these jobs aren't coming back. I think that we can bring factory jobs back to the United States. Now, you're quite right. A factory is very different today than it was 25 years ago, no question about it. We can bring our mining jobs back. In fact, it's interesting. Since Trump was elected, we've created 35,000 new mining jobs, which is fantastic. You go to these coal towns and you see what liberal regulations did to these coal towns, where they just obliterated these towns. One of the most hype-breaking, I went to these places, in West Virginia and Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and liberals say how much they care about working class Americans. Look what they did to the lives of these people. It was heartbreaking and disgusting. And Trump basically said, well, you know what? I'm going to put you back in those jobs where you belong, and I think he's going to succeed in that. And by the way, you may say, well, this is going to cause global warming. Right now, China is building 150 new coal plants. So the idea that we're going to stop global warming by America, unilaterally, economically disarming ourselves is really a pretty stupid idea. So I do think the economy is improving. I think things are feeling better about the way things are going in this country. That's why the consumer confidence numbers are so interesting. And the last thing I'll say as a conservative, because I know there are some conservatives in this room, even if you disagree with everything that Donald Trump has done up to today, and I wonder if you agree with me, getting Gorsuch on the court, how sweet was that, right?
Agreed.
Before you grab it, I just want to clarify, and I'm not going to tell you, this is not, I just want to clarify, because it's an important point. I agree that jobs can come back, and I'm a huge critic of our trade policies. When I say that Donald Trump lied to people, though, what I say is that he created a fantasy that the jobs will come back as they were, rather than as the jobs of the future. And I wish he had gone to a Bernie Sanders rally and heard Bernie Sanders talk about what jobs can be done. And one final thing, just to clarify, just a quick clarification. When you talk about the majority of the American people, Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes.
Donald Trump never stepped foot in California and New York. And ladies and gentlemen, you play by the rules.
Hillary Clinton didn't come to Wisconsin.
Yeah, but that was a big mistake. But look, I'll say this because it's interesting. Trump had a very specific strategy. He was going to win 7 states: Florida, North Carolina, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Iowa. And he ran the table, and the rest of the states didn't matter. And that was Bannon. You may hate Steve Bannon, but he masterminded the whole thing of crashing through that blue wall. Those are industrial union states, and what was so significant, I think, about this election, for the first time in 30 years, Republicans won back working class Americans. It's something for liberals and Democrats to think about. How are they going to win back those voters that swing back and forth? But a lot of those voters felt like Democrats didn't really care about them anymore. And in a lot of ways, I think they were right.
Hey, Mark, you gave a pretty good indictment, I think, day by day, of how you see the first 100 days. I want you to look forward, though, and I want to take the same question I just posed, and I want you to tell us what Donald Trump's administration could do to improve in the area that you're a specialist in. What could they do in the next 100 days to make us better?
Yeah, and some things that Bob mentioned are some change on a positive note. I mean, General Mattis as the Secretary of Defense is a very positive step. General McMaster's in the National Security Council is a very positive step. It's rather troubling when you go deeper in some of those areas in the national security perspective. I believe that we had Katie McFarland, whose background was Fox News correspondent, I believe, to come into national security. Well, they gave her the golden parachute. I guess she's going to be the ambassador in Singapore. So slowly, through whatever mechanism, I think that General McMaster is getting out of the National Security Council a lot of those folks that really should not have been brought in there to start with. I mean, it just, the Sebastian Gorkas of the world and others just have no place in that space. And it's for people in my community, it's embarrassing and it's actually insulting to see things like that happen. So moving forward, there's going to have to be a lot of changes, and there's going to have to be the other branches of government doing their job. We have invested a lot of power in the office of the president under Bush and under Obama, and those powers convey to a administration that, in my opinion, from a national security perspective, is on shaky ground right now. And so we're going to have to be very careful in the manner in which that we are enacting laws, and that the legislative branch needs to man up, woman up, and do their job to protect the Constitution to ensure, because it doesn't matter what your party or administration is. Once they get that job, they all want the most power, more power than anyone else. And so I think that's what we're going to have to see competency brought in rather than loyalty into those key positions.
Okay, bring in better people
but there are some also very good people there already, and someone I didn't mention, but I should have, and I think she has a bright future in the Republican Party, is Governor Haley of South Carolina, who's doing an exemplary job at the United Nations. And as for what Trump could do, the single most important thing he could do to bolster deterrence and serve American interests in the most vital geopolitical region for the 21st century is cultivate a broad and deep relationship with a decent democratic India that shares a common strategic perspective on constraining Chinese ambitions and has a radical Islamist threat of their own. Now, Dan Pipes, who's a pretty respected guy, uses the term Islamism. And so there are a lot of respectable people, including the great Bernard Lewis, who would accept the idea that there is a phenomenon called Islamic fascism that the United States has to resist stoutly, although East Asia and stopping Putin rank #1 and #2. On a positive side, for all of Donald Trump's ill-advised flirtations with Putin, that strike against Syria did more to take on Putin and Putin's client than 8 years of Obama's reset, where we enabled Putin, didn't arm the Ukrainians, canceled unilaterally missile defense in East Central Europe, demoralized our democratic allies. In many ways, for all the misgivings, Donald Trump has proved to be a much better friend of NATO and a much better friend of America's democratic friends, including Israel, than his benighted predecessor.
Are you itching to respond to that?
Well, not sure that bombing a runway in Syria quite altered the history of the world quite so thoroughly as some may think.
But Obama's back down did. We're still living the ramifications.
Look, rather than get into a deep debate on Syria here, I happen to believe that at the most fundamental level, what we've heard from here, we have reasonable people kind of offering, even though we may disagree, some different perspectives on what this guy is doing. And it is true, you can point to some people that he has put in some national security positions that are, folks that at least there can be a little bit of bipartisan agreement. But where I've got the problem, and where I have the fundamental problem with, is that we are literally sitting here, better part of 100 days into this guy's presidency, trying to read the tea leaves of how he wants to deal with all these things. And we have a good friend here on the panel saying, yeah, boy, he's putting Putin in his place. And it's just my impression, maybe I got this wrong. I kind of thought Putin wanted Trump president more than he wanted Hillary Clinton. And so my sense is, yes, well, why was that? Is it in fact because all these players around the world really hated what Barack Obama was trying to do with sort of really trying to balance things out and deal with some really complex issues, and thought that Hillary Clinton would continue that, and they just thought, well, that's got to stop. Or is Donald Trump, though a smart man in many ways, so weak and so ill-defined that, as I said, better part of 100 days into his presidency, we're still trying to figure out what he means, what he's doing, and why he's doing it. And we are literally now watching palace intrigues in the White House. Is this person in the room? Is that person in the room? Does Jared like Ivanka? And does Ivanka not like this? And I'm telling you, that is a weak and dysfunctional president of the United States. He is not leading. And the notion that dropping a bomb on a runway in Syria and then having your Secretary of State say the next day, well, we're not really changing anything here, that is somehow leadership? No, it's not. It's not. And we really ought to pause here, people. And if you care about America, you got one of two ways to go. Pray that Donald Trump gets serious about this job, or go back and read those 6 references in our Constitution to impeachment.
Okay. I think we want to turn to some student questions now. And this first one, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but I think it's in the minds of a lot of people. This is from Zena. Thank you, Zena, for sending this forward. She says, I feel as though this panel has become too polarized. Which is exactly what is wrong with our politics today. If we keep pointing fingers at each other, we're going to get nowhere. So instead of what can Donald Trump and his administration do to make America great again, what are some of the steps that he can do and that we should do? We have a role in this too. We're citizens. We have a responsibility to be informed and active citizens. So let's take that question from both those sides.
Well, let me start with that, because I think it's a great question. And look, I've been in politics. I've been in Washington for 34 years, and I've never seen the country as polarized as it is today. Never. I always tell the story when I went out to Ohio and did an event for Trump near the Indiana border, and all these towns I went through are just all little tiny little Mayberry RFD towns. And we're driving for about 45 minutes, and all I saw, every other house, Trump, 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 Trump. And then I finally saw a blue Hillary sign that said Hillary for prison. So but then when you went to the cities, oh my goodness, I mean, nobody in the cities voted for. So we're culturally and politically and economically divided like no other, and it's not healthy. And in fact, I would almost say we're more, politically divided any time since 1863 in this country. I mean, I really believe that this country, you go to Alabama and then you go to, a place like Massachusetts, you might as well be in two different countries. So, and it's troubling to me. I'm a conservative, but I think, and I agree, with what you said at the end there, that, if Trump is going to be successful, he has to unify this country. Now, I'm going to say something about Obama. I think this is where Obama failed us. I think he failed us because he made everything he did legislatively, he did with one party. He passed Obamacare without a single Republican vote. He passed that $800 billion debt bomb spending bill without a single vote. He passed everything with only Democrats. And that, I always thought at the time, this is not the formula for political success. This is a president, when you go back and think about Obama, when he came into office, the American people really wanted this president to succeed. The first black president ever, young, dynamic, charismatic, and he was pretty responsible, I think, for this polarization. He never once in 8 years, not once did he reach across the table to the Republicans. I was there. He never once did it. Now, maybe, look, there may be one or two exceptions, but on the big issues, he didn't. So I would say that one of the things that troubles me about where we're headed right now, and this started in Obama, but Trump is doing it too, is the bypassing of the legislative branch. And all of these decisions now being made by executive order. Look, I like you, respect the United States Constitution. It's the greatest document, other than the Bible, ever written. It is a playbook. And we do have three branches of government. And this idea that we're going to just have a president as a dictator make all of these decisions, and it started under Obama, and Trump is doing it now, I think it's a big mistake. We should put more power, and by the way, Congress, shame on Congress for allowing the president to do this, right? They should take back their powers of the purse and the legislative branch. If Trump is going to be successful, he has to find a way to unite the country, and that might be on some issues where he can reach across the aisle. I'll just give you one example, and then I'll stop. What I proposed with my buddy Larry Kudlow and Art Laffer, we got to get this tax cut done. We got as you said, we got the highest tax rates in the world. It's so catastrophic for our economy. It's disabling, and we can get a lot of those jobs back just by we don't need trade protection. We just cut our regulations and taxes. Those businesses will come back. So what I propose to the White House, I think they may do this, is look, why don't you have a big business tax cut for our corporations and our 26.5 million small businesses that also face the highest tax rates in the world, and then put in place a big infrastructure bill, which is what Democrats want. So you got something Republicans want in the tax cut, got something the Democrats want in this infrastructure bill. Don't even call it a tax cut, call it a jobs bill. And why not pass that with 65% 70 votes in the Senate, and hopefully 280 votes in the House. Those are the kinds of things that happen a lot. And I agree, I think we need to see Trump reaching across the aisle with the Democrats and getting some of these things done. And we'll see if that's possible. Because right now, what the Democrats in Washington basically say, Trump is an illegitimate president, and we're not going to help him one iota. And that's just un-American to me to do that.
One of the reasons that politics is so partisan is healthy. We are fundamentally divided on first principles. Most American elections happen, to use a football metaphor, I come from a better football town 5 miles from Schaefer Gillette Stadium in New England, so I'm going to rub it in. But most elections historically are between the 40-yard lines, and not that much separates the parties. There are, to use the term by Walter Dean Burnham, the political scientist, critical realignments, critical elections. 1860 is one, 1932, where we are fundamentally divided. We're fundamentally divided about what the role of government should be in the economy, generating wealth and distributing it. We're fundamentally divided about what America's role in the world ought to be. We're fundamentally divided as to whether the arrogance of American power is a greater threat than the threat posed by our enemies, or whether we are most dangerous or most insecure when the United States is perceived to be weak and irresolute. And many of these policy differences cannot be effaced by cosmetics. The American people are going to have to try to disagree agreeably but vigorously to work out a new consensus. If you go back to the elections, Gertrude Himmelfarb in 1998 predicted all this in a great little book called Two Cultures, One Nation. She said, we're almost divided 50-50 on all the fundamental issues of the day. And if you look at the closeness of the Bush-Gore race and this race, we are a divided country on first principles, and there's no way of avoiding partisanship because we have to work that out. That's what a democracy does. You can't elide these disputes. You can't run from them. We're going to have to be honest about them and try to work them out. But I actually think that the partisanship on both sides is healthy. This is what makes us different than China, where 99% of the people vote for a single candidate. This is healthy. It's healthy because we're divided. Don't blame the politicians. They're a reflection of us. We're divided.
Yeah, I'd like to add something here. And this polarization is critical because there's some areas that were sacrosanct, and that was national security. And so with the Senate Intelligence Committee and the HIPC, the House Intelligence Committee, they were groups that really operated in a bipartisan manner. When Dianne Feinstein was the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, when they came out with the torture report, there was overwhelming support. There was some after the fact, but they pushed to have that investigated and that report be released. Seeing what happened with Nunes in the House Committee, where it was clearly partisanship going on there, it took it to a level that had not been used before, and a path we had not gone down. And so what troubles me is if we're now going to push those social issues or economic issues that the parties have to really jeopardize and compromise that national security space. Now, on a good note, seeing Senator Burr and Senator Warner stand up there and do their thing in private is very encouraging. That's how it needs to work to preserve this democracy. And so for me, that's the type of behavior we need to see more of, where understand your economic policy is different, but our national security is paramount here. And without that, we have nothing else.
But national security has been partisan from the beginning. Go back to Jefferson and Hamilton and the disagreements on whether we should be pro-neutral toward the British or the French during the French Revolution. The Church Commission in the 1970s was highly partisan. The America Firsters in the 1930s. I'm not saying it's good, but national security is no stranger to divisive partisanship historically.
Correct, but they played fairly. Now they're playing unfairly.
In fairness, I love this guy, right? I'm not sure the American Firsters always played fairly, but I'm actually going to totally disagree. I don't think we're nearly as divided as our media and politics industrial complex tells us we are. The fact is, if you look at polling, or if you go to a Bernie Sanders rally, or even some Republican rallies, you find Americans really had a huge problem with our trade policies. And it crossed ideological and partisan boundaries. If you ask people what they want in a healthcare system, I mean, this is why the Obamacare repeal and replace crashed and burned. It is because Americans are remarkably united on the premise that they think you shouldn't die because you're poor. And the fact of the matter is, when you go down issue after issue, you get incredibly high percentages of agreement among Americans. We're into the 90% range on many campaign finance issues of people wanting to get big money out of politics. And you know what else people really agree on at fundamental levels? We don't want any more unnecessary and really ill-conceived, fundamentally ill-conceived military adventures abroad that seem to be driven more by ideology or economics than by the national interest of the United States of America. So we have a lot of agreement across lines of partisan and ideological difference. And in one of the panels earlier, people said, well, who should we be following? Who should we be looking at? And I said, on this Syria issue, I, of course, always say you should follow Barbara Lee, because Barbara Lee has actually gotten a lot of this stuff right for a very long time. But I also recommended that you follow Justin Amash, the very, very conservative Republican from Western Michigan, who has been on a daily basis tweeting that President Trump was wrong to launch this military raid without consulting the Congress of the United States of America. And Justin Amash has on a daily basis been saying, you are at odds with the Constitution of this country. You are not respecting the basic premises of America. Rand Paul has said much the same thing. And so the bottom line is my criticism is not of left and right, Democrat and Republican. My criticism is frankly of a media system in this country that creates the fantasy that we are fundamentally divided on a whole bunch of issues and that we put one talking head there and I'm one of them and another there and we yell about it. The truth of the matter is we agree on a whole bunch of things, but there are some very, very powerful people that don't want to give us what we want. And so they create the fantasy of deep division, and we are far less divided.
So let me make a point about something on the Constitution. I mean, you know, one of the things I respect about this conference is that, you know, it's been such respectful audiences, and I appreciate that because I know probably more than half of you in this room probably don't agree with my position. But one of the areas I think we all need to come together on is rediscovering the value of the First Amendment in this country. And I was actually somewhat hesitant to come here because I have been shouted down on college campuses at least 5 times in the last 2 years. And it's been and they're basically taking my First Amendment away from me. Now, look, there's an old saying that, you know, I may not agree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And and this is mostly liberals who are not allowing conservatives to speak on college campuses. And this is a big, big problem in America because if there's one place in America where free expression and exchange of ideas should be rewarded and fruitful, it should be on college campuses, but it's not happening today. So I'm going to make a challenge to the liberals in this town. Don't ever allow that to happen here at UC. Don't allow that to happen. Always, at Colorado, always make sure that people have the right to speak because the First Amendment right is probably one of our most valuable rights that we have.
Well said. Hopefully the Conference on World Affairs is demonstrative of that. So I want to go, I'm blessed as a moderator with more questions than we can possibly get to, so I'm going to challenge the panel to a lightning round. Are you up for it?
Yep.
All right. These are student questions. So we've talked a lot about economic and international military type questions, but what about human rights? It's not just about the economy. So here's the question, brief answers. What's the role of the president in dealing with human rights and social issues? What's their role? And what's Trump's record so far in his first 100 days?
American military power and alliances have done more to further human rights in the 20th and 21st century than any of the alternatives, and President Trump's record is mixed, but his recognition, I hope, it's the wish, the father to my thought, of the importance of democratic alliances in the restoration of American military power will have a net positive contribution to human rights, although there are dilemmas because sometimes you have to choose the lesser evil to avert the greater one. Egypt under General Sisi is an example of that. There's no democratic option available, and to undermine him would make the situation worse.
Mark?
This country was founded upon human rights. I mean, that is why we rebelled against England And so that is paramount to everything we do and should do. And I'm not sure, at least, and I hate the term the candidate Trump and the President Trump because it's Donald Trump, it's the same person. But I was deeply concerned when I heard candidates, not just him but others, articulating and running for election on what would be a war crimes platform. That we should waterboard and worse, we should torture, we should pillage, take oil. These are international war crimes. We can't do that. And so, you know, for me, having spent, 31 years with the government and then another 7 years as a security consultant, I came to a revelation that I always thought I was an operator and, a door kicker and doing all those things through my career. And I realized what I really was just a human rights advocate. I mean, that's what I did. That's what I was protecting, investigating, doing counterintelligence, counterterrorism. So that's what I did. I'm a human rights person.
So I'll just address one issue, the human rights issue that's really been front and center, and that's the issue of immigration. I'm just talking personally now, not for Trump or the administration. I believe that immigration is one of our greatest assets in this country. It is what it gives us an incredible comparative advantage over the rest of the world. We do get the best and the brightest and the hardest working people from the rest of the world, and it's an amazing advantage that we have. But it's also true that the American people, when you talked about consensus, I actually think there would be a consensus on immigration. The American people, and you may disagree with them on this, but I think it's one of the issues that the overwhelming Americans want. They want to secure this border. We are a sovereign country, and we have the right as a nation to decide who's going to become a citizen of this country and who's not. I mean, we have that right as a sovereign nation. This idea that anybody can just flow over the border and come into this country, most Americans disagree with that. And so here I think is the bargain where you could get I think we're going to see an improvement. Once Americans believe at least that Washington is making some kind of effort to deal with the border and to make sure people are not just coming across the border illegally, then I think we could have a very humane policy that allows the people that we need into this country, whether it's the brainiacs who come in with these incredible degrees, the mathematicians and the physicists and the engineers and so on. We need, all over the country, we need farm workers. There's no question about it. Those people who pick our food and so on are great assets to America. And I think the American people, once they believe that Washington has made a good faith effort to secure the border, that we will expand immigration and let people come into this country, and we should do that. One quick story, I remember when I was at the Wall Street Journal last week, we were met by the economic minister of China. And he was talking about how great things were in China and how they were going to become the global economic superpower. And he was going on, very much boasting about everything. And he said, in 5 years, we're going to overtake the United States as the economic superpower. And I'll never forget, because you cut me, I bleed red, white, and blue. So I said, sir, not in my lifetime is that going to happen, that China has become the economic superpower. And I said, the reason that's not going to happen, with all due respect, is because our Chinese are so much smarter than your Chinese. He didn't like that very much. But
our lightning round has turned into a sustained storm. But let me be very, very quick here and say, as regards human rights, which is our core question, Donald Trump was profoundly moved, and I will accept this, and I believe this, I want to believe this, by the images of children who died because of a use of chemical weapons. But he was not moved enough to say that those children should be accepted into the United States as refugees. He preferred to bomb an airstrip in Syria. That is an absurd construct. And so Donald Trump has sent the worst messages again and again and again as regards human rights. His Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has been disengaged from and often dismissive from human rights concerns when it should be a central responsibility of our Secretary of State. And I will close just very quickly and say that what Donald Trump has said and what people in his administration have said again and again and again about Islam in this country and beyond its border is an assault on religion. And when you assault religions without any sort of reasonable clarity or any sort of reasonable discussion, you assault human rights in a very, very fundamental way. And this administration has done an incredibly lousy job of fostering respect for religious diversity on this planet and respecting fostering respect for other religions. And it's fascinating to me how frequently now I go to George W. Bush and say, you know, look, you can have a president, Republican or Democrat, who is respectful of Islam, who is respectful of religious differences, who tries to teach the American people to put fears and prejudices aside and to teach the rest of the world to do the same. Donald Trump is not doing that. His Secretary of State is not doing that, and they should be ashamed.
Thus ends our lightning round, unfortunately. I've got about 50 more questions. I want to thank these panelists, and would you please join me in a round of applause? I'd also like to thank the audience for the great questions. The panel is now concluded. Thanks for attending.